This week there was a very interesting talk given by John Mearscheimer. John Mearscheimer, who's a famous realist in the School of International Relations, he spoke at the Committee for the Republic this week, which is a non-partisan, non-profit organisation that hosts speakers on challenges to the American Republic. If you don't know John, he's a very well educated and thoughtful speaker, and who for 40 years has really led the realist segment of the international relations world, and is credited as being one of the primary voices predicting that the Ukraine war would start. He's been predicting this since 2008, when the Bucharest NATO summit declaration announced that both Ukraine and Georgia would join NATO. It's an interesting period of time. There's a lot of people clearly that do support the idea that the NATO expansion to the east is the primary cause for Putin and Russia moving into the Ukraine, invading Ukraine. While a lot of people play this down, if you take the time to listen to some of John Mearscheimer's videos since 2008, 2010, even up until today, talking about why he believes that is the cause of the Russian invasion, it's a very compelling story that he lays out very logically described. I'll just read a little bit from the NATO announcement from Bucharest in 2008. Point 23. NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO. The next step for Ukraine and Georgia on the way to membership. Today we make clear that we support these countries' application. Therefore, we'll now begin a period of intensive engagement with both at a high political level to address the questions still outstanding. We've asked foreign ministers to make their first assessments of progress at the December 2008 meeting. Well, this announcement by NATO, while well received by the West, was seen as a clear stepping over of a red line that Putin had described to the West, because this was seen as the opportunity for the West to move into Ukraine, its weapons, and have them on the border of Russia, something which the Russian nation sees as an existential threat, really, which is something that in this recent talk that John Mearscheimer gave, he mentioned this. And as a summary of some of the things he discussed in a very interesting talk, was when talking about the Ukrainian war, he sees no opportunity to achieve peace. He doesn't see a way that Russia will concede the territory or it's already taken, and that the Ukraine and the USA will not accept neutrality of the Ukraine. Russia sees the current Western actions as posing an existential threat to Russia, and this is supported by things like the talk from the West of breaking Russia up and deposing Putin, and establishing a new government ultimately in Russia. When asked about, when talking about his assessment of the war, his assessment is that Russia is winning, and that Russia will win. And he breaks this down quite simply by an assessment of three factors. One of them being the resolve of the nations involved, their resolve to win and to fight. And on this point, he believes they're equally matched. Both Ukraine and Russia see this fight as being one which is an existential threat to their nation's existence. The second point is one of population, because in a war of attrition, which this war seems to be, this grinding sort of war, the population base that you have to call upon to fight that war has an impact. Already Ukraine has lost 8 million refugees to Europe, another 3 million moving to Russia, and with a population of 43 million, that sees them in a large deficit to Russia's 143 million. The third point is artillery. John mentions the king of war in a war of attrition is artillery. Most of the losses being reported are due to artillery, and there's talk of a 4 or 5 to 1 shell advantage to Russia. So Russia's military complex has got the capability to produce shells at an incredible rate. There's been admission already from the West, from the United States and from NATO nations, that they don't have the capacity to produce shells in those numbers. South Korea is shipping 500,000 shells to Ukraine to help with the upcoming Ukrainian offensive. The Russians are talking of shell production levels of 200,000 a month and increasing that over the coming years to something around the scale of 6 or 7 million shells per year. So pulling those three factors together, he arrives at an assessment where he sees that not only is Russia, in his opinion, winning the war at the moment with the capture of Bakhmut as an example, but also that he sees Russia will go on to win the war. One of the myths that John talks about and I guess destroys is the myth that you require 3 attackers to every 1 defender, and therefore Russia will be losing at least 3 to 1 casualties, so 3 dead Russians to every dead Ukrainian. However, some of the points that he mentions here are that both sides are attacking. In many of the battles, the attacker will be Russia in one day, taking an area, and then Ukraine will attack and reclaim that area, and there's back and forth with an average advancement favourable to the Russians. But both are attacking and both are defending. So it's not a clear-cut case of just one attacker. Also, the tactics being used by the Russians are considered to have evolved and being clever, where they're using small numbers out front to force Ukraine to identify their location, reveal where they are, and then the Russians are pouring on heavy artillery onto those locations, and Ukraine are unable to do the same due to this lack of artillery that they're suffering, while the Russians still have large numbers. So John estimates a casualty ratio of at least 2 to 1 in favour of the Russians, so 2 Ukrainian casualties for every 1 Russian casualty, although he mentions other people he talks with who believe that number might be 3 or 4 or 5 to 1 being possible. And when he discusses this, he sounds as if he's being conservative about those numbers. So higher numbers in some areas like Bakhmut could be very possible. So it's a very sobering assessment of the casualties being inflicted in this war, and it's based in good logic. I'll put a link down to the video in the details. This does, however, leave the question of what will happen next, and how will the war conclude. Most likely, he sees this as being Russia moves west to the Dnieper. If we have a look here at the map of Ukraine, the Dnieper River running down through the centre here. Mearscheimer's assessment is that Russia will take 8 of these oblasts, taking their claimed land up to the Dnieper, including taking Odessa and keeping Crimea. So he doesn't see any case in which Crimea will be given back, or that any of the land captured thus far will be given back, and that the ultimate gain is to probably capture all of the dominant Russian-speaking oblasts, and possibly some more up in the north here, taking Odessa, which will then reconnect Transnistria through to Russia, as well as then throttling Ukraine's access to ports. This would leave Ukraine really as a failed state, with itself being reduced by size in half, ending up with a demilitarized zone running north to south along Dnieper, Kiev being redefined in terms of what that city might look like, the Ukrainian government ousted and forced to accept neutrality. So this is what he believes the Russians are looking for, and ultimately will work towards. And once they've reached that point is when the war itself may not end, but there may be a cessation of fighting, with Russia holding those new borders and that demilitarized zone existing in the middle of Ukraine. This does, however, raise the spectre of increased NATO involvement. if America and the West and the Ukraine are pushed to that level, then the likelihood that NATO may become involved on a larger scale becomes a very real possibility. If we look here at the NATO member states, Ukraine is bordered by NATO states here in the blue, and so if they were to find that Russia had effectively taken half of the Ukraine to the Dnieper, then it is possible that NATO would become more involved. Interesting to see what happens there. Now, just as a little summary of some other news that's been going on, there has been fighting going on in the Kherson region. Ukrainians have been attacking in that area. Russian artillery has been working in that area and has apparently or allegedly destroyed a howitzer. Drones attempting to attack oil refinery in Russia's southwest. TASS, a Russian news agency, has claimed that those drones have been neutralized. And interestingly, Saudi Arabia is in talks to join the BRICS Bank. So one of the outcomes of this Western and NATO and EU involvement in this conflict with Ukraine and Russia is that there has been a strengthening of ties between the BRICS group, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now with Saudi Arabia in talks to join the BRICS Bank. This is another sign of the Western world and the United States in particular losing its power over these nations, perhaps leading to ideas of the de-dollarization, the US dollar being reduced in its capacity as a reserve currency, and the breakdown of the US petrodollar. So, interesting subject, not really my field of expertise, but something that I might do a bit more research on and just follow that just to see what happens there. Other than that, Turkish voters back to the ballot box. So Erdogan being favoured to win. Interestingly, if we look at the map, Turkey, and there's a NATO state. Erdogan, though, very friendly with the Russians, and that's seeming to be growing recently. The Russians certainly would be looking for Erdogan to retain his presidency. It's a runoff election with Erdogan receiving, I think, 49.5% in the original election. The other main candidate getting about 44%, and then a third candidate who captured about 5% of the votes has endorsed Erdogan. So, yeah, that will be interesting again to see just what the results of that are. Finally, in terms of Ukraine today, blasts being reported in Kiev throughout the day. So I need to go and do a little research to find out a little bit more about that, and might put that in tomorrow's update. Thank you.